Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Migration Speaker Series event, a conversation with Dr. Ming Hsu Chen on her book, Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Vanessa Olguin. I am a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences, majoring in government and the interdisciplinary college scholar program, and minoring in migrations. I'm a part of the inaugural cohort of Migration Scholars, a fantastic group of undergraduates passionate about migrations research and collaborating with the Migrations Initiative. Thank you to eCornell and to Cornell University's Migrations Initiative for hosting this discussion, which is part of a larger speaker series called Reimagining Citizenship. The Interdisciplinary Initiative studies how all living things migrate from place to place on our planet, and you can engage with more of this work through upcoming activities this semester, including a film series with Cornell Cinema and a new podcast called Migrations, A World on the Move. More information about all of these programs, including the next event in this series, can be found at migrations.cornell.edu/learn. As we begin today's program, I would like to first acknowledge the land on which many of us are on here today. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokohono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokohono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayokohono dispossession and we honor the ongoing connection of Gayokohono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. This acknowledgement does not exist in the past tense or historical context, but with recognition that colonialism is a current ongoing process and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Shannon Gleeson, the moderator for our event today, who will be introducing Dr. Ming Hsu Chen. Professor Gleeson is Associate Professor of Labor Relations Law and History at the Cornell Industrial and Labor Relations School. She earned her PhD in sociology and demography from the University of California, Berkeley, and was previously on the faculty of Latin American and Latino Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her recent books include Building Citizenship from Below, Precarity, Migration, and Agency, published by Routledge in 2017, as well as Accountability Across Borders, Migrant Rights in North America, published by University of Texas Press in 2019.
Thank you, Vanessa. I really appreciate that very generous introduction. And it is my great pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with my friend and colleague, Dr. Ming Hsu Chen. She is an associate professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where she is a faculty member at the law school. And she also is a faculty director of the Immigration and Citizenship Law program with various affiliations on campus. She is a fantastic person to have here today because, like the spirit of our Migrations Initiative, she brings an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of immigration, civil rights, and the administrative state. And you can find her really rich offering of classes at the CU Law School. But she also has research on citizenship that is bridging both the law as well as social science. And she is writing about this in her new book, Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, which has been published by Stanford University Press. And I'm really happy to have her here today to talk. So I will turn it over to her to give us an overview of the key themes of the book. And then I'm looking forward to being in conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon. And what Shannon didn't mention is indeed friends and colleagues for, goodness, more than a decade now. So it's really a pleasure to be able to come share the book with you, and in particular to be in conversation with Professor Gleeson about the book. So the book is titled Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, and it starts with a central question, which is why immigrants are pursuing citizenship, and why specifically now. You see, in an average year, only about half of those who are eligible for citizenship actually apply. But over the last 4 years, that percentage has risen almost 10%. And whether or not we think that this is a good thing and how we understand why this is happening are really the motivation for this book. So to give you an overview of how the book is structured, there are essentially 3 chunks. The first part of the book describes the situation that we're currently in and how it is that the binary version of immigration produces the kinds of citizenship inequalities that I'll be talking about. The second part of the book is the fun part. Those are the stories of immigrants that were gained with interviews, many in Colorado, but also all over the country in many different legal categories. And then the third piece, which I will touch on in the presentation, but I'm happy to carry into Q&A, is about how we move forward, which is, was an interest of mine throughout the book. And now that we are in a new presidential administration is something that I imagine a lot of people have on their mind. So let me start with the first part of the presentation, which is how we got here. So I think many people think about immigration as being a legal binary. And the choices are that you're either a citizen or you're an immigrant, and you're legal or you're illegal. And then that makes you an insider or an outsider. And usually the US-Mexico border is considered the dividing line. But that binary is oversimplistic and it's rather incomplete. And so what I try to do in the book is to give you a fuller sense of what citizenship looks like. Now, first on the legal status piece, those of you who are familiar with immigration law know that the reality is immigrants come to the United States in many different ways. And they live here in many different statuses, and some become citizens and some don't. So for example, immigrants might come to the United States in one of these pathways that leads them to a green card, sometimes shorthanded as LPR or lawful permanent resident, and that gives them the possibility of going on to citizenship. There are other immigrants who come on a temporary visa, some of whom will be able to adjust and follow that same pathway of getting a green card and becoming citizens. Others won't. And individuals who come without documents who will have a very difficult time being able to move up this pathway to citizenship. So that's what I call the law school version of understanding immigration. And it is already much more complex than the common view. But what I try to do in the book is also to go beyond formal citizenship, to consider the substantive aspects of what it means to be included in the United States. And in keeping with many sociologists who study immigrant integration, I look at 4 different dimensions. First, the social dimension of citizenship or social belonging, things like whether a person feels that they are connected in their neighborhood or whether they feel that they are discriminated against. I also look at the economic dimensions of citizenship. So whether someone feels like they have a good job or if they have a chance of a good future for their family. And then finally, I look at political citizenship. And this essentially is about feeling that your voice is heard and that it matters in the United States. So the way that I studied these questions, as I mentioned, was significantly through interviews. There are about 100 immigrants that I interviewed for this book, and they follow roughly these 4 categories. Those who have high levels of formal citizenship are on this side. Those are often the green card holders or those who have not only a legal status, but an ability to eventually become a US citizen. And then you'll see through the stories that some of those individuals are higher or lower in substantive citizenship in terms of social, economic, and political integration. And then on the other side of the chart, we have those who are lower in formal citizenship, and again, with some variation in terms of their substantive citizenship. So let me bring this chart to life by telling you just a few of the 100 stories. And what I'll try to do is to pick one to illustrate each of the 4 boxes here so that you can get a flavor of what the rest of the interviews looked like. So the image that I have here at the bottom is an image of Salvador Hernandez. And he is a community organizer in Colorado who works with Mi Familia. And they run citizenship workshops on a monthly basis where they help those who are already eligible for citizenship complete the form that they need to fill out, which is called the N400. And Salvador told me that at many of these workshops, the immigrants who were turning up and standing in longer and longer lines had been eligible for 10 or 15 years. Most of them were not showing up on the first day they were eligible. And that really raised the question not only about why they wanted to pursue citizenship, but why they wanted to pursue it now in this particular moment between 2017 and 2020 when we saw that 10% increase. And the stories that I heard resoundingly said that the reason that green card holders were coming forward is simply because they felt like they couldn't be non-citizens anymore. That in the political climate that we had and with the raft of anti-immigrant policies, they felt they needed the protection of citizenship in order to feel safe, in order to feel secure in the United States. An even more extreme version of this lower substantive belonging might be the refugees that I studied in the stories, in the interviews, who felt that they might be always a refugee, never American, even though refugees as a whole actually do naturalize at much higher rates than the general population. Now, this is not the same story or experience that everybody has. There is a much larger category of immigrants like Bob Marshall here, who is a professor at the University of Colorado where I work. Now, Bob is a Canadian immigrant. He came to the United States initially as an international student, and then over time, he got a green card when he married a US citizen. And when I met him, he had been eligible for citizenship for about 20 years, but he had never really felt a need to naturalize. And the reason was, and these are his own words, he said that he felt that he was an invisible immigrant, essentially that people wouldn't have known that he was an immigrant, given his skin color, his fluency in English, his relatively privileged economic status. But what was interesting is the same day that we were having coffee, Bob told me that after 20 years of eligibility, he had actually filled out a draft of the N-400, that form that you need to become a citizen. And he was still deciding whether or not he should turn it in. As it turns out, he still has not become a citizen. But the reason that he was thinking about it in that moment, I think, is very similar to what immigrants like Salvador and those that he was working with were experiencing. And that is to say that when there were policies like the Muslim travel ban that came in 2017, it became a wake-up call to all green card holders, to all immigrants, even those who were not targets of the Muslim ban, such as those from Canada, like Bob, or those from Mexico, like Salvador. They also were not targets for deportation. So this deportation machine, the heavy enforcement, was not a direct threat to them as green card holders, and yet it still served to make them feel less secure in the United States. So the lesson of the stories of formal citizenship are in many ways a story about the limits of the law. All of these immigrants were on a path to formal citizenship, but they had a range of substantive experiences. Many of them felt a form of citizenship insecurity that went anything from their experiences as immigrants of darker skin colors who might then be grouped with other disfavored minorities in the United States, or the refugees, as I mentioned, who felt that socially and culturally that they were very distant. And this, in part, is the explanation of the rising trend of defensive citizenship, and the idea that immigrants felt that citizenship had become a strategy for their own protection. Now, let me turn to the other side of the chart, and this side is actually much more varied. So again, I'm just giving you slivers of the stories out there. But as I mentioned, on the lower side of formal citizenship, there are those who still experience high levels of substantive belonging, even though they lack legal status. And then there are those who, as might be more understandable, lack both substantive belonging and formal citizenship. So I won't spend a lot of time on this block because I'm guessing many of you who are tuning into a Migrations Initiative series are probably familiar with the story of Dreamers. But as one example, the idea here is summarized very much in this magazine cover. It is the idea of feeling American, having been in the United States from a very young age, having English be a predominant, if not a primary language, and having spent one's life in American schools. And yet, the asterisk is that many of these individuals felt that they were Americans, just not legally. And Gabrielle was one of the students I spoke with who said she originally thought that she could be in DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival status, forever. And that contributed to her sense of belonging. It was just a piece of paper. It didn't really change anything about her lived experience. But after a variety of policy changes, including the attempted rescission of DACA in 2017, she felt that she realized that nobody was secure. And she couldn't count on DACA or the promise of a DREAM Act to feel secure. And the other stories, this is actually a very, very category, but these are individuals who came to the United States on temporary visas. And at the University of Colorado and Cornell and many other universities around the country, the largest number of international students are from China, and many of them are coming in STEM-related disciplines. So as one example, there was an immigrant I interviewed named May, and she talked about feeling that her time in the United States, while relatively pleasant, was just time that she was spending as a guest. She didn't feel in any sense that she was part of the university's community or part of the national community. And when I asked her if she were ever to become eligible for a green card, which she wouldn't on the international student visa that she had, but if she could imagine that future, would she want to become a citizen? And she said that she really wasn't sure. She said it might be nice to have a green card. That would probably help her find a job. It might make it easier to travel back and forth to China. But whether or not she wanted to take that next step, she was pretty ambivalent. She said that it essentially just depended on a weighing of costs and benefits. Right? So she had this very thin sense of citizenship and belonging, despite the fact that many people think about international students and high-skilled workers who come in similar visa categories as being in a position of privilege. Their experience of being in the United States substantively can be quite hollow. So to sum up some of the lessons that come from the low formal status side of the chart, the immigrants that I studied all had either blocked paths to citizenship, like the Dreamers, or broken paths, like international students who wouldn't be able to become citizens on their visa, but might have a possibility of adjusting to a more permanent status later on. As with those who had a stronger formal citizenship, there was a mix of substantive experiences. In all cases, whatever level of insecurity they felt was heightened during the years of the Trump administration, where immigrant exclusion and immigrant enforcement were the dominant focus of federal immigration policy. Now, if we look to the images on the bottom, there was a turn in the writing of this book. Those of you who have written books know that it takes a lot of years to finish them. And I turned in the manuscript for this book in March of 2020. Which means that I turned it in just as the country was starting to realize that COVID-19 is something that we were going to be dealing with as a nation. And when something really big happens, you always wonder what it's going to mean for the message in your book. And in this case, fortunately for my research, perhaps not fortunately for the immigrants I interviewed, I found that the experience of COVID-19 and the perceptions of a disease following immigrants into the United States and all the corresponding travel bans only heightened the sense of citizenship insecurity that I had found in the book during my years of research. So as one snapshot of that, during the Trump years, there were more than 400 immigrant-related actions, and more than 50 of them dealt with COVID-19 itself. So I think many of the experiences that I report on in the book are ones that we continue to contend with now. So that does bring us to the final picture, which is how we move forward. How can we move forward where we are still coping with the COVID-19, but we are also presented with some level of promise with a new administration that has proposed legislation like the Citizenship Act of 2021. And I would summarize the suggestions that are in the book by pointing to these broad principles. First, of making integration the North Star of our immigration policy. And that would follow all of the dimensions that I tracked. And so, for example, some of these are things that the Biden administration has already done, such as thinking socially about the meaning of being an immigrant as being a future citizen or a future American, with the shift in language from the government referring to non-citizens as aliens, instead using the word non-citizen. And so, as one advocacy group that I've participated in has said, the shift would be from alien to non-citizen to citizen. And that change in language, I think, signals a change in social belonging. In addition, there are many dimensions of economic inclusion that would go along with this idea of integration. One of them would be a revisit of the public charge rule, one that many have thought of as a wealth test for immigrants who rely on public benefits that they are legally eligible for, but worry about the possibility that will count against them later on when they try to become citizens. And finally, the battles over the inclusion of immigrants in the census and whether they ought to instead be excluded as formal non-citizens. And that is a policy that has already been changed in the Biden administration, but that would be an example of political exclusion. Finally, there are a number of ways that we need to move on the formal side of citizenship. And these are more direct policy suggestions to change the paths available. My contention is that they would need to be tailored to each of the types of immigrant experiences I talked about. For the green card holders, it would mean having a smoother path to citizenship, thinking about things like the citizenship test, the cost of the citizenship application, difficulties with language and translation, significant backlogs in the U.S. citizenship and immigration services. So smoothing that path would be one way to build stronger paths for green card holders, and some of those are addressed in the Citizenship Act of 2021. Secondly, for temporary visitors, we need to think about on-ramps, and those could include immigrants such as the ones that I spoke with, mostly high-skilled immigrants and international students, or it could include many of the essential workers who have shown their significance in the during the period of COVID-19 as healthcare workers, as restaurant workers, as grocery store workers, and as agricultural workers. And so another piece of the Citizenship Act of 2021 talks about at least giving them what they call blue cards in order to stabilize their status, and then the greater possibility of being able to adjust to a green card status in recognition of the service that they'd given to the United States. And finally, for undocumented immigrants, to think about a way to create a path to citizenship that doesn't exist. And that has probably been one of the headlines of the proposed legislation. So I'll pause there, and I'm happy to continue the conversation first with Professor Gleeson and then with the rest of you who are out there.
Thank you, Ming. This is a really fantastic overview of a book. I really commend it to everyone. And I just want to remind the group that if you want to ask a question, which we'll be incorporating in a bit, you can click on the chat icon on the Zoom portal. So please do weigh in with whatever questions you may have. We have a lot of ground to cover. And I wanted to start us with just revisiting one of the key themes in your book, which is, again, moving beyond these binaries. So much of the policy debate in this country has been at that intersection of undocumented and documented. We know that, for example, 5% of the civilian workforce is undocumented. But I would say most of the debates and most of the political discussions are about those 11 to 12 million individuals. But what is missed is what you refer to as the spectrum of citizenship. And so I wanted you to talk about that spectrum and how that becomes important, especially in light of the current, what's being referred to as the Biden bill that's being presented before Congress. And if you had a chance to take a look at it, it's a thick set of propositions. But if you could just talk about what do we learn by taking this perspective of a spectrum of citizenship rather than focusing only on binaries? What might we learn by that?
Sure. And yes, it is thick. It's about 350 pages in both the House and the Senate versions of the bill. Well, I mean, as you said, the headline has been the 11 million undocumented immigrants, but that really just scratches the surface of, I think, what makes this proposed legislation pretty bold and pretty ambitious. The idea of the spectrum of citizenship, I think, shows that there are a lot of different facets of immigration, of the immigration system that need fixing. And I think people across the political spectrum would generally agree with that. And so some of the reforms that are talked about would pertain specifically to temporary workers, and in particular, some of the agricultural workers that have been talked about in Congress for many, many years, but have not seen legislative relief. And again, this idea of blue cards, I think, really captures something to recognize that many of these immigrants might not immediately be eligible for a green card. It's not going to be that a magic wand is waved in order to immediately grant them, or even in 8 years grant them the kind of citizenship that other immigrants might experience, but to create even just that possibility. And then similarly, for those who already have those temporary paths, to be thinking about ways to model perhaps the H-1B path for high-skilled workers that does allow people the potential to live in the present and also envision a future in the United States. And then the last thing I would say about is something I touched on earlier, is that in addition to thinking about those formal paths, we really do need to think about the complex experience of immigrants living in the United States. And that does include more than their legal status. It's not going to be just a legal fix. And I think that is going to require a lot of support for people's needs socially, economically, as well as politically.
I wanted to incorporate a couple of the questions that we have rolling in. I think so much of the focus right now has been on the current propositions under the new administration, but one of our audience members asks if you had any thoughts going back to even the Clinton administration and the Jordan Commission. I know this is reaching a ways back, but what I remember of that Jordan Commission, which is a bipartisan committee that was chaired by Texan Barbara Jordan, was that it had a more restrictionist approach, and it certainly had a big focus on, I think what was the tagline there was protecting not only diversity, but also the local economy. And I think that some of the vestiges of that tension remain in the current legislation. And I just wondered, as a more general point, if you had any thoughts about the current bill and how some of these debates that we have tackled throughout administrations continue, and what is your research tell us about the enduring relevance of those conversations?
When I talk with my students about comprehensive immigration reform, which became the buzzword around the time of the Jordan Commission, with its recommendations to change many different aspects of immigration, the idea is that there's a three-legged stool. And that there always would have to be political compromises in trying to make significant reform. And so one of those pieces might be to talk about the legal migration system, things like the temporary visas and the green cards that I referred to in the book. Another piece would be to deal with enforcement. And a lot of that dealt with enforcement at the border. Some of that also addressed the economic issues that you refer to, most notably the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act that created a lot of disincentives for immigrants to accept work if they didn't have the documents to support it. And then the last piece would be to think about undocumented immigrants who are already in the country. So it had become conventional wisdom that you would need to have all three pieces being worked on. And I think that one of the distinctive features of this particular proposal is that it is much more heavy on the integration and legal immigration side. It would include the pathway for undocumented immigrants. But again, it's really pushing hard on that. On the enforcement side, I think it's a bit more subtle. I won't say it's absent. I think it is subtle by talking more about things like having some equity and humanity in the enforcement regime that we have, or even the idea of pursuing economic development in areas of Central America that have become a significant source of migration to the United States as almost a preventative measure for undocumented immigration that comes across the US-Mexico border. But the emphasis assuredly is more on integration, and I think that's notable. And while I'm not in Congress, I'm not in DC. My sense is that the reason it's set up that way is because people are envisioning a piecemeal strategy to legislative reform, where they want to be able to break off these pieces rather than have some internal compromises where integration almost always falls off the table.
Right. And my read of the bill, too, is that the more incorporative pieces of it do detract from the pieces of the immigration enforcement virus that you talk about that will maybe not be hardened, but not necessarily be softened. And we know this also going back into the Clinton era with some of the criminalizing provisions that were put in place. And so I think that will be something that advocates will continue to fight on, probably also in a very piecemeal fashion. So, one of the things that I also find really exciting about reading your book is some of you may know about, before I started my academic career, I spent some time working in a small immigration rights clinic with a nonprofit in Silicon Valley, helping people do exactly the process that you talk about, which is filling out naturalization forms with the iconic N400. At the time, it was only a couple $100s. Remind us, how much is it now?
Right now, it is about $600.
Yeah.
As of last summer, it would have been over
$1,000, right? Yeah. So the price has gone up, and some of the things involved in the bureaucracy perhaps have changed a bit. But I wondered, more than anything, the world has changed a lot since when I was doing this right at the turn of 2000, 2001. And you talk in the book a lot about the impact that September 11th had, not only in the immigration bureaucracy, but also in terms of the types of barriers that individuals who are pursuing citizenship or thinking about the naturalization process are facing. And so I wondered, given this set of changes, not only in terms of the bureaucracy, but also the world, the reconfiguration of the DHS, et cetera, what would you say are some of the biggest differences that a naturalization applicant that, say, was in my clinic at the time would have faced compared to the folks that you were interviewing?
First, let me just say that I really appreciate that you pin the turning point to a pre-Trump era. I think that's important because a lot of people think that when I talk about enforcement, I'm only talking about Trump. When I talk about the enforcement era, I'm certainly including Trump, but it didn't all begin with the Trump administration, and that's important to know because it won't all end with the end of the Trump administration. So, what I would say is that the challenges of integration at the federal level have indeed always been there. But I think they've been heightened, they've been exacerbated by a lot of the more exclusionary policies. And so if I can get into a little bit of the granular detail, one thing that the former INS Commissioner Doris Meissner has said is that we need to put the S back in, at that point, the service mission back in the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Or in this moment, you might say, post 9/11, we need to put the S back in the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to recognize that there is a branch of the federal government that is meant to see itself as providing a service, dispensing immigrant benefits like green cards that might allow someone to get to citizenship. And what we've seen over the last 4 years instead is almost a swallowing up of that integration focus by the enforcement mission of the broader Department of Homeland Security. And so, one really significant example is that outside this book, I worked on a government report for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights about the backlogs in citizenship, which have in some cases reached, more than 2 or 3 years once someone is already eligible to become a citizen. And one of the reasons that backlog has developed is that the funding for the USCIS has largely been directed to a fraud and detection unit within the USCIS, right? And so it wasn't that fraud detection didn't exist before, but that's an enforcement mission that's been embedded inside the service agency. Another example is CARP, which is a program that is meant to target those who raise the risk of being a national security threat. And I'll leave to you whether you think it's a coincidence or not, but almost every case that's been flagged is for an individual who came originally from a Muslim majority country. And I think that's directly the result of policies stemming from 9/11 and this idea of extreme vetting that we saw subsequently with the Trump's Muslim travel ban, and that has itself become a roadblock for those who would otherwise be eligible for citizenship.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important for us to be engaging in this distinction between what you say is this formal and substantive citizenship. And so much of the work that I, including, do focuses on this changing of the bureaucracy, the actual ability for people to adjust their status, be it into LPR status or into citizenship. And a lot of what you're highlighting is what are the racial hierarchies, what are the forms of ethno-religious discrimination into which immigrants are incorporating, and what does that mean about their ability to continue to not only pursue well-being, but also some of the other political and civic engagement pieces that we tend to focus on in terms of the benefits of naturalization. But I wanted to bring this back to some of the conversations we're having, not only in the realm of immigration, but also in the broader racial justice movement, which is this distinction between formal and substantive citizenship. Anyone who has studied T.H. Marshall knows that the conversations around citizenship actually began with how we understand, for example, the disenfranchisement of former slaves, Native Americans, and much of the kind of fundamental writing on immigration stems from what do we know about the development of citizenship with these other marginalized communities. And so I wondered, in the current moment in which we find ourselves and have found ourselves for a long time, what opportunities do you see for peeling back this focus, almost hyper focus on formal citizenship, either in terms of legalizing or documenting the undocumented, or get out the vote and kind of encouraging people to become citizens through that process? And I say this especially at a time when we are seeing virulent racism against Asian Americans, which the media is not covering. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the heightened awareness around racial injustice, the particular moment we find ourselves in COVID, but even beyond. And what does this kind of breaking apart, this assumption that once you get either LPR status, your green card, or citizenship, that somehow you're good, that you're going to seamlessly integrate and be faced with an equal system in the United States. Can you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, those are such rich questions. And some of them are ones that I'm still puzzling over and hoping to write about more in my next major project. I hesitate to call it the next book, but that might be what it becomes. I do think, one way to understand the takeaway of this book is to say that we need to help immigrants pursue citizenship. Right. So it is kind of similar to the legislation that we've been talking about. It is heavily focused on formal citizenship. I don't know if I would say that is hyper-focused, because I think the message of the book is just a little more nuanced than what I said. I think it's to say that it is necessary to have formal citizenship, but that it is not sufficient. Right. And so it is a foundation that I think we need to build on. And if we look at the broader context of citizenship for African Americans, for women, for birthright citizens who came from Asia, over the arc of the Civil War Reconstruction in the late 1800s, I think you see a similar trajectory. Right. You have the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment abolishing slavery. And then subsequently you deal with political incorporation in the 15th Amendment, for women in the 19th Amendment. And then many of those battles about economic belonging are still very much being worked on, right? Because we still know that we have economic disparities that have only been intensified during COVID-19. So that trajectory, I think, in some ways has parallels with what I'm arguing for in the book. I don't think anyone would want to reject formal citizenship if it was available to them. There's a lot of research that shows that there is a citizenship premium that shows itself in wage increases and certainly psychologically in terms of the security people feel as opposed to the precarity that I know you yourself have written about. And I think that is something that is true. It is almost endemic to the condition of being a non-citizen, especially when enforcement is strong. Your question about Asian Americans, I think, is one that is very close to my heart, and I think also a really important one, because I do think that sometimes there is a tendency in America to think about disadvantage as being focused solely on those who have the many different interconnected experiences of being of darker skin color. And of having negative experiences with law enforcement, and taking nothing away from that. I did think it was very interesting to interview immigrants who many would perceive as quite privileged. Many international students wouldn't be able to afford coming to the United States were it not that their family had a fair amount of economic stability. If we move out of the Asian experience, people like Bob Marshall who are coming from Canada, right? All of these individuals also talked about a sense of insecurity. And so I found that to be really fascinating. And it did really point out the need to disaggregate those threads of what we think about as disadvantage and what we think about as privilege.
Yeah. I mean, I think that these multiple interlocking layers of disadvantage operate both simultaneously, but also intersect, right? So xenophobia and the othering that happens through the immigration experience is also very much intersecting with different kinds of experience of racism, right? And so the anti-Blackness that is pervasive in this country has a generalizing effect, but it is also a very particular experience, and that there are other forms of exclusion that we want to understand in that broader context that is the United States, but certainly economic mobility in and of itself does not free individuals from those experiences, and the othering that happens with this kind of perpetual foreigner connotation that many folks that you talk to feel. I think is important for us as both race scholars and immigration scholars. I wanted to pull together kind of a set of questions that are coming in from our colleagues in the chat, and to set this up as questions around both the policies and the debates happening around a CIR, comprehensive immigration bill, but also the kind of political realities of bipartisanship. And so Dan Kowalski, who's one of our immigration scholars and practitioners, talks about, for example, the very utilitarian conversations that are happening around the benefits that immigrants might bring. Economic demographers have written a lot about what is the impact of migration, particularly for federal programs like Social Security and Medicare. That is both because of the aging population in the United States, something that countries like Italy and Japan know a lot about. And so the kind of changing the population pyramid there, but also, ironically, the disproportionate number of undocumented folks who pay into these systems but don't reap the rewards also changes the calculus. And so you have that set of questions as the population in the United States is changing, but also as Stephen Allaire, our other immigration colleague, talks about this increasingly polarized set of American politics, including, but also way beyond immigration. And so they both are wondering, how do we tackle these big policy questions? Again, I often tell my students immigration debates are happening not in a vacuum, but in the context of all these other conversations we're having, but also given the highly polarized environment in which we live. And so neither of us are political strategists, but we are observers of Congress. And so I'm just curious if you have any reflections given the perspective you have on the ground in terms of what are some ways forward that just take account of those both economic and demographic realities, as well as the political ones that Steve raises.
That's a big question. I think that one way to move forward, and I don't want this to be misheard, I think one way to move forward is to start with the areas where you can build some kind of political consensus. And so I do think that that is something we're seeing with the prioritizing of Dreamers. And I know Dreamers themselves, who are very thoughtful about these issues, have sometimes talked about not wanting to avail themselves of political sympathy for their situation if it means leaving out others, including their own parents in many cases, who would not meet the statutory requirements for going down this pathway to citizenship. And so I think that's one place to start. It's just not where we want to end, right? And so I think one thing to be careful about is letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and wanting to see this comprehensive reform just because, as I mentioned, the vision of the bill is quite ambitious. But when it comes down to turning a vision into actual policy, I think there does need to be a willingness to take those incremental steps. The reason we had a Civil Rights Act of 1964 is because Brown versus Board of Education didn't take care of everything in 1954, right? So you're not always going to see all of the progress in a single step. I think thinking about green card holder is another example, because I think a lot of American citizens can see their own lives and people in their families and workplaces and schools who were once green card holders. And that's where I think this idea of being future Americans could be very motivating.
Yeah, and just to add on to one of the very good points you made, the policymaking process itself is its own set of considerations. But as one of our colleagues, Els de Graaf, also talks about, paying attention to the implementation then of whatever we end up with, and the many more actors far beyond the DC loop that are going to be implicated in that process. And I wanted to just take advantage, because we're on this point, to pull in one of the questions from a budding immigration scholar, Hunter, who talks about this issue of the substantive and more incorporative approach of localities, like those that have been dubbed sanctuary cities. And while that, a lot has been written about their ability to actually tackle this enforcement bias of the immigration system, he wonders, what do we know about, some of the many things that you're talking about in terms of creating these paths to integration, even in the absence of a federal regime that's doing this in a fully funded way. And what has the last administration done to either dismantle some of the progress we've made on that front, or in my case, I'm wondering also maybe even rejuvenate or to mobilize some of the local ground up efforts in this regard, even in the absence of federal reform in the direction that you seem to advocate?
Mm-hmm. I think the role of states and localities, and I would add to that nonprofits, essentially the role of the non-federal government actors has always been a crucial piece of integration, and that'll continue to be true going forward. We keep referring to the proposed legislation, even though it's not the law right now. But again, because I do think in many ways it is a vision document. If you look at the section of the bill that looks at integration, a significant piece of it is reallocating funds and resources to states and localities and nonprofits so that they can deliver on the work of conducting English language courses and job training, of working with refugees on resettlement issues. And so it definitely needs to be a partnership between the federal government and other entities that are closer to the ground and closer to the daily experiences of immigrants. I like the idea of a partnership, or even like a hub and spokes kind of image, I think, more than seeing this as an either or. Again, because I think the federal government and local government have different roles to play in the multidimensional project of integration. And so, as you mentioned, I think a lot of the state and local movement has emerged in the gaps where federal immigration policy didn't take care of the problem. But I think you would need it anyway, right? Because if you had a path to citizenship for everybody, which is the kind of thing that the federal legislation would usually try to focus on, you would still need to think about economic integration and social integration, and things that are very hard to do from the top down. And so in that sense, I think there are some ways that the challenges that we're dealing with now are enduring challenges. We had them before, and we're going to continue to have to work on them.
Right. And I think this focus on what localities and both the civic sphere are doing, be it formal nonprofits and philanthropic groups, as Elstager and I have written about, or grassroots organizers and social movements, that has to be part of the conversation. And it strikes me that those groups, in some cases, are doing the work solely focused on immigrant rights, but more often than not are doing that work in coalition with other forms of advocacy, be it around worker justice or economic precarity. You talked a lot about, for example, the public charge rule, which would really devastate some of the even thin social safety net opportunities available to even those migrants who have legal status. Some of them, but they're also doing this work in the arena, to go back to one of our earlier themes of racial injustice, and, which is one of many forms of social integration. And so, with that in mind, I wondered, you and I are both writing also in the field, in the arena of scholars who do this work on critical race theory. And I wondered, what do you think that the current immigration debates tend to miss, or maybe even sometimes willfully ignore, about the role not only of economic precarity, but also race and racisms, things that just legalizing an entire population or naturalizing an entire population don't necessarily get at? And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you'd like to see those conversations be more in concert with each other.
Sure. And this is a place where I think I would say that this blind spot that exists in separating the experiences of immigrants from separating experiences of racial exclusion, I think that extends beyond policymakers to, frankly, I think we're guilty of it. I think a lot of academics do the same thing, and particularly where I'm situated, primarily in a law school, I think immigration lawyers and race race scholars are particularly particularly guilty of this. And so, as one example, one thing I admire about the social scientists is that many of the people who study immigrants also study Latinos and Asian Americans. And that might seem like an obvious move, given that Latinos are the largest foreign-born population in the United States, and that Asian Americans are the fastest growing foreign-born population in the United States. But I will say in law schools and in legal scholarship, the equality laws that grew out of the Civil Rights Act are a separate set of statutes than the INA, the immigration statute. And so they're usually taught in different courses. And so I do think that there is often this division and this pulling apart of issues that are both intertwined conceptually, but are literally intertwined in the life of the many immigrants who are simultaneously non-citizens and member of racialized groups. And so that's actually where I want to go in my next project. I have a tentative title. I just need to write the rest of the book that goes with the title. But this idea of colorblind nationalism, to understand that there is a way of blinding ourselves to the racial dimension of immigration policy. When we talk about the border being something that's neutral, right? That the country obviously needs to protect its borders. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a nation unto itself. And that it just so happens that we exclude some people. And if we take this very moment, it just so happens that we're excluding people who are coming in who might be threats for public health reasons. And it just so happens that that public health threat is seen to have originated in Wuhan, China. And it just so happens that we're excluding Asian Americans who have a long history of being excluded that goes back to the late 1800s and laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act. Right. So I think in reality, it's not possible to talk about fixing immigration without also talking about racial equality. But I do think sometimes those become separate conversations. And so that even among friends, there are lost opportunities for solidarity in those movements.
Yeah, and I think the things that you raise here, I think for me, situate the academic sphere in which we are all operating as an important part of the visionary conversation, not only in terms of future orientation, but also looking backwards to understand where we ended up, the process of really denaturalizing these, and not the naturalization that we're talking about here, but denaturalizing the assumptions we make about how we ended up where we are, and questioning and revisiting the assumptions about how nation states came to be, how borders came to be constructed, how the categories of subject and other emerged. And, not to say that these things don't have real life consequences, as do racial and gender constructs, but that they are socially constructed and therefore can be unmade, as Ming Nai also talks about. And so I think that this is really important. We had a question in the chat that was part of this visionary conversation of, why don't we have a space where these constraints of the political aren't present, not a citizenship-free space. It makes me remember, if we have any other Berkeley colleagues, that small little space on Sproul Hall on campus, which is the free speech zone. Why is it that we don't really have a space where the constraints of citizenship don't operate? Why does this is so pervasive, not only in the United States, but everywhere? And I think that those visionary conversations can oftentimes be disregarded as not being relevant to the here and now, but I think are important for us to not necessarily just get caught up in our, particular domestic politics of talking about policymaking. And so I appreciate the ways in which we have the privilege to have those conversations, both facing the current political moment, but also thinking about what is the future that we want to co-construct. But I want to go back to methodology, because I am an empiricist, and I want to just make sure that everybody understands the work that really went into pulling together the just sampling of stories that you told us today. And it's impressive on a number of different fronts. On the one hand, you pulled together these comparative stories of different individuals who are on the citizenship spectrum. And some of these categories of folks are perhaps easier to access than others for a whole host of reasons. And so I wanted you to talk about this, especially for those graduate students or other researchers who are listening in, who are wondering about how you pull off comparative research in a very volatile, changing political environment. And so can you talk more about this process of talking to people, which is essentially what you did? I commend to everyone the appendix in Ming's book, which lays this out in a very accessible way. How do you go about asking people about their naturalization journey and their intentions, and how willing were folks to talk with you and your team? You have a team of folks you are also working with in these settings. So can you say something about that?
Sure. And I'm smiling because, Shannon will know that she was a sounding board on the methodology at many moments in this project when I was trying to figure out how to conduct this study in a way that would create a coherent story and yet also just be true to the many varied experiences of the immigrants who are in this book. At a high level, I showed you that 2x2 grid. I mean, in reality, there were 6 legal categories that I was intentionally sampling for in thinking about what it means to be a non-citizen in the United States. And even with 6 legal categories, I was very conscious of the fact that I was still leaving other categories out. On one end of the spectrum, it would have been interesting to include US-born citizens, perhaps, or at least naturalized citizens, because, if you're moving up that chart to the high formal, high substantive, that would be a way to extend that spectrum. But perhaps in a way that might be of greater concern, the spectrum also could have extended further in the direction of undocumented immigrants who don't have the protection of DACA, or green card holders who had committed who have a criminal conviction that would make them deportable, at risk of both losing their green card, but also needing to leave the country. Right. And so one of the reasons that I didn't take those 2 tails, especially the one over here, is because those individuals would be much more difficult to interview. I think that in terms of getting clearance from the Institutional Review Board and simply being able to establish the trust that would be needed in a book process that was relatively quick, I think would be very difficult. Again, my reassurance is that I think the stories that I tell in this book are probably even more true. The story of citizenship and security would be even more true for those who are further down that end of the spectrum. But I do think that was one piece of it. Another thing I'll say is that, in terms of there were many moments where I felt like I was trying to hit a moving target. Because the immigration policies kept changing. So, for example, I started some of my DACA interviews before DACA was rescinded, and some of them, and then DACA was rescinded, and I thought, oh no, are these stories still going to be true, right? And then there was litigation that went through the Supreme Court that only last summer got resolved. Go back. And so to the extent that I was able, I went back to individuals that I had interviewed with shorter surveys, to take their temperature and to see if there had been significant developments. And similarly, with the refugees, I have to say that one was really, really challenging. The refugees we interviewed were much more willing to talk to us at the beginning of this process. And after the Muslim travel ban, after the lowering of the ceiling of refugee admissions, after a lot of state resettlement agencies had lost funding, I found that refugees were a lot more nervous, and frankly, their gatekeepers, a lot of their service providers, didn't really want myself or my team of student research assistants to potentially re-traumatize these refugees or in any way put them at risk. And again, I'm still talking about the more secure strata of refugees, right? These are the individuals who are already inside the country, not the asylum seekers who are trying to receive a legal status. But that was very challenging. And similarly with the vets, I mean, some of the vets we interviewed were deported. We had to set up Skype interviews long before we were all using Zoom to talk with deported vets as well as veterans who were inside the country. So there were a lot of very particular challenges, especially with those groups whose stories I think are less frequently told.
We have about 10 or 15 more minutes, but I think we're going to continue the conversation and incorporating some of the great questions that are emerging in the chat. And I wanted to keep going down this a little bit more, this area of methodology and the doing of the research that is required. And we had a great question from one of our university librarians that talks about kind of the changing political environment and what this means for the archive. And you were in a not only, currently political volatile moment, but just the ways in which we do research on a particular category of folks changes over time, right? And so this colleague talks about the ways in which even the recent change in language that we have seen reflected, you refer to this, but we've seen formal statements and formal policy change, but even just the language that we used to refer to, in this case, illegal aliens, which for a long time has been the term that the US government has used, to now undocumented immigrants. And I'm wondering, as these changes occur, how does this impact the way we construct an archive or construct categories of migrants over time, but also the kind of research that you're doing as a legal scholar and as a social scientist? And I think Gerald Beasley is asking, how would your research be affected by libraries and the Library of Congress kind of keeping up with the times and changing things like subject headings to keep up with this? And this is perhaps an esoteric question, but it's one that I think speaks to this broader issue of historical work, and also trying to situate our own, for those you and I who are doing more presentist work, situate our work in the long lineage of immigration policy making and immigration policy research that's happening. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of how the archive kind of persists or becomes more challenging to trace over time?
Sure. So I think if I were to kick that up in terms of a notch in terms of an abstraction, Something that I feel very strongly about is the use of mixed methods, including and especially qualitative methods like interviewing. And I think that does help to get around some of the problems that would arise if I was solely focusing on government data or on quantitative data keeping. So, like, for example, when I talked about the rising naturalization trend that kind of defies the longer trajectory of history, if I was just looking at the data points, I would know very little about what was happening to create that change, right? And it was only by talking with immigrants about their motivations for wanting to naturalize and how those were changing and what they saw in the policy environment that was producing those changes, that I could start to interpret that quantitative data in a more meaningful way. So I think to the extent that it's possible to add those additional dimensions to be able to triangulate, I do think that that gives you a better understanding. My interviews were still pretty structured. I did use coding software, and I suppose the codes would be off if the language changed dramatically, although certainly there are ways that you can search for multiple terms and to be able to combine them. But I do think that is just one example of how qualitative data can help. Specifically with archives, I do think that this is another instance of where you need to have the kind of thick interpretation that, again, exceeds the counting of things. Again, not that is not of some value, but I think it is of more value when it is contextualized historically as well as socially. And you can't do everything in one book. There was a piece of this where I was like, I should be writing about these dynamics in multiple slices of history. And in multiple stages of people's lives. Like, it would have been really neat to do a longitudinal study of an immigrant, in that chart that I showed you, first arriving in the United States, getting the green card, getting the citizenship. But that was too much to take on in one single book. And so, in that sense, I think being able to think broadly and to know those histories, even if they're not presented in the book itself, I think is potentially very helpful.
Right. And I think in addition to language changing, terminology changing and policies changing, the actual bureaucracies in place are changing. So one of the things that, for example, my students talked about this week is the fact that the Immigration and Naturalization Service was once housed in the Department of Labor and later moved to the Department of Justice. And even in the last 2 decades, you talk about this shift from the Immigration and Naturalization Service post 9/11 to then the Department of Homeland Security. And now we see calls to abolish ICE, the Immigration Customs and Enforcement. And I just wondered, given what we know about its predecessor, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which carried out many of the same functions, even if in a different bureaucratic form than the current ICE and DHS setup, it still lacked the same integration functions that you are really calling for, and which you suggest we desperately need to invest in, not only at the federal, but at the local level. So I wondered if you can say more about, what is needed to shift this enforcement bias, short of, I think, what we also need to think of, which is engaging the carceral state and the broader questions even beyond immigration. But if we're really going to make some strides in immigrant well-being as a national priority, beyond shifting policies and bureaucracies, which I think will be part of that process, what else would you suggest is needed to move out of this focus on enforcement into integration and well-being? Well,
to pick up with the last question, this is one of those moments where history is very helpful because it does help you to see the path dependence, that we've gone on, where the enforcement functions have moved further and further into the national security and the security state. Right? That there were alternative pathways that the Jordan Commission, among other things, at the same time were considering whether immigrant benefits should be housed in the State Department. Because a lot of the visas that are issued are either similar or connected to the issuance of visas within the United States. So thinking about that as an alternative possibility, I think, is a very interesting one. I think another thing I would say is that in thinking about how you deal with the interlocking pieces about the immigrant experience, One proposal that has been talked about a lot, it was talked about at the end of the Obama administration, I know it's been talked about among immigration advocates, is being able to have more interagency collaboration, either through informal working groups or through the creation of a White House office that would oversee many different agencies who are working on different aspects of immigration. And so I was looking for it in the Biden bill, as you said. The closest I saw was some kind of a citizenship foundation, but it looked like that would still be housed in the USCIS. Alternatively, in a piece of legislation that is also reemerging, the New Deal for New Americans, there is centrally this idea of the creation of a White House office. And I think there's some promise there. I mean, again, there's going to have to be a partnership in order to see this vision implemented within agencies. But I think having that dexterity to be able to have somebody who is seeing the whole picture and then able to coordinate the economic activities and the public health activities and the national security and other dimensions, the discrimination components of being an immigrant, I think that would be of value so that things are not slipping through the cracks and that one side is not swallowing up another.
Right. A lot of the work that I do on labor standards enforcement talks about this need to do more interagency collaboration, even in one particular arena of, low wage workers. But then a lot of the other work I do also, and which you do also, is skeptical about what that interagency collaboration looks like if there are anti-immigrant actors at play. And so the MOUs, the Memorandum of Understanding between the Department of Labor and the Department of Homeland Security, are meant as a way to try to shield the impact of immigration enforcement on other rights arenas. We also know that DACA and TPS recipients have been nervous about, what will be done with their data. And we know that the IRS and the Social Security Administration shares data all the time, which feed into the enforcement arena. And so I think this is a really important point that we have to be able to cooperate not only within the federal government, but also up and down the line with states and localities. But then we have all these other examples of interagency collaboration, 287G, et cetera. The list goes on that can make us nervous about this. But I think it'll be really interesting to see how do we re-envision the possibilities for those collaborations and the distribution of funds in a way that is, not so focused on enforcement, and how do we continue to protect this ethos even as the political winds change. Yeah. And so I look forward to that conversation. I want to end, we have about, 3 to 5 minutes left with looking to the next election. I know we've all kind of settled in to our, almost 2 months of breathing. But as we settle into the current administration, we know that parties and candidates are already gearing up for the next round. And what will likely follow, especially as we've seen in your work in Colorado and in other places, are these typical pushes towards naturalization drives and get out the vote campaigns. And I just wondered, for those listening in with an eye towards the political sphere, what insights you might offer if we want to have lasting impacts for immigrant communities rather than simply just instrumental focus on a particular election or a particular campaign. The labor movement also is guilty of some of this kind of narrow focus. And so what can we learn about the ways in which we can make use of these energizing moments, but at the same time, think long-term for the dynamics that you're talking about in your book?
Mm-hmm. I think that, there's a lot that happened in the last election that makes you feel like our system fell apart. But there were some stories, some success stories within them. And I think one of them is that the turnout of a lot of the foreign-born communities, Asian Americans, Latinos, was at historic high. And we saw that made a difference. In places like Georgia, which of course was very closely watched to the very, very end, the mobilization of Latino voters and Asian Americans mattered greatly. And then within the Asian American population, the movement of Vietnamese and Hmong groups closer to the Democratic side also made a difference in terms of the eventual electoral outcome. So I do think one of the big success stories is a mobilization story. And, if this isn't too, self-serving, I think that the image of the spectrum of citizenship that I talk about in the book, I think is a useful one. We talk about pipelines to college. There are pipelines to being voters. Right? If you're an immigrant, you do have to go all the way down that spectrum, from having a temporary status to a permanent status to naturalizing to registering in many places and then becoming a voter, right? So I think there do need to be protections at every stage of that pipeline. And I think there was a lot of promising work done there. But, that work is already beginning for the elections that will come in 2 and 4 years. Things like the census too, I think things that seem very technical, I think can't be forgotten. And, we won't have time to talk about it here, but there are 2 articles that I'm working on. There are 2 halves of a project called The Political Misrepresentation of Immigrants. A piece of it will come out with the NYU Law Review. The other one will come out with the Colorado Law Review. One deals with voting and one deals with the census. And in some ways, it feels far removed to talk about voting and immigrants in the same sentence. But again, I think they're connected along that pipeline.
Well, thank you so much, Ming. This has been an incredible conversation, and I hope just the start for folks who are interested in finding out more about your work. There's a lot more to read and to hear. I also commend to you a recent TEDx talk that Ming did with the group out in Denver, a very accessible and really timely conversation around some of these themes. And so I welcome everyone to continue the conversation in whatever circle you're in and to attend our next migration speaker series, which you can find information on our website. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And